court, counsel, members of the jury. His name was George Perry Floyd Jr., and he was born on October 14, 1973, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. To his parents, George Floyd Sr. and Larcinia Jones Floyd, Sissy, the matriarch. Now, you met George Floyd's brother, Philonis, and you heard all about Sissy Floyd. She was George Floyd's mom. She was the mom of the house. She was the mom of the neighborhood. And you heard about the special bond that she and George Floyd shared during his life. You heard about their relationship, how he would always take time, special attention to be with his mother, how he would still cuddle with her in the fetal position. You heard that. And from George Floyd's brother, you learned all about George's childhood. And during his time growing up in that house, George Floyd was surrounded by people he knew, people who knew him, people he recognized, a familiar face to pick out in the crowd. People need that. George Floyd was surrounded by people he cared about and who cared about him throughout his life, throughout his childhood in that house, through his adolescence, into his adulthood. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd died, face down on the pavement, right on 38th and Chicago, in Minneapolis. Nine minutes and 29 seconds. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. During this time, George Floyd struggled, desperate to breathe, to make enough room in his chest to breathe. But the force was too much. He was trapped. He was trapped with the unyielding pavement underneath him, as unyielding as the men who held him down, pushing him. A knee to the neck, a knee to the back, twisting his fingers, holding his legs for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the defendant's weight on him. The lungs in his chest, unable to expand because there wasn't enough room to breathe. George Floyd tried. He pushed his bare shoulder against the pavement to lift himself, to give his chest, to give his lungs enough room in his chest to breathe, with the pavement tearing into his bare skin. As he desperately pushed with his knuckles to make space so he'd have room to breathe, the pavement lacerating his knuckles. The defendant stayed on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So desperate to breathe, he pushed with his face, to lift himself, to open his chest, to give his lungs room to breathe. The pavement tearing into his skin, George Floyd losing strength. Not superhuman strength. There was no superhuman strength that day. There's no superhuman strength because there's no such thing as a superhuman. Those exist in comic books. And 38th in Chicago is a very real place. Not superhumans. Only humans. Just a human, just a man lying on the pavement, being pressed upon, desperately crying out. A grown man crying out for his mother. A human being. And in that time, and in that place, while he was surrounded in life by people he knew him, faces he could pick out, there was no one there he knew. He was surrounded by strangers. Strangers, all of them. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He's surrounded by strangers, not a familiar face to say his final words. But he did say them to someone. He said them to someone who he did not know by name, but he knew him from the uniform he wore and the badge he wore. And he called him Mr. Officer. That's what he called him, Mr. Officer. Mr. Officer would help. We call the police when we need help. And he pleaded with Mr. Officer. George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant. He asked for help with his very last breath. But Mr. Officer did not help. The defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand, to twist his fingers into the handcuffs that bound him, looking at him, staring down at times the horrified bystanders who had gathered and watched this unfold. The motto of the Minneapolis Police Department is to protect with courage and to serve with compassion. But George Floyd was not a threat to anyone. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He wasn't trying to do anything to anyone. Facing George Floyd that day, that did not require 1 ounce of courage, and none was shown on that day. No courage was required. All that was required was a little compassion. And none was shown on that day. George Floyd said, "I'm not trying to win." This was a call about a counterfeit $20 bill. All that was required was some compassion. Humans need that. People need that. But more fundamental than that, and more practical, at that time, in that place, what George Floyd needed was some oxygen. That's what he needed. He needed to breathe. Because people need that. Humans need that. To breathe. And he said that. And the defendant heard him say that. Over and over. He heard him, but he just didn't listen. He continued to push him down, to grind into him, to shimmy, to twist his hand for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He begged, George Floyd begged until he could speak no more, and the defendant continued this assault. When he was unable to speak, the defendant continued. When he was unable to breathe, the defendant continued beyond the point that he had a pulse. Beyond the point that he had a pulse, the defendant continued this assault. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. When the ambulance arrived, the ambulance was here. And the defendant continued. He stayed on top of him. He would not get up. He would not let up. He stayed on him, grinding into him, continuing to twist his fingers, to hold him down. He had no pulse. He was not breathing. He was not responsive, and the defendant had to know what was right beneath him. Right beneath him. You saw the video. You saw the point when the ambulance arrived, and finally, after a paramedic got out, and the defendant still did not get up, and the paramedic tapped him, and finally the defendant got up, and they lifted Mr. Floyd onto that gurney, and you saw the way he was not, there was nothing there. His head had to be held to prevent it from falling to the ground. He was completely limp. The defendant had to know that. He was there. He was on top of him. And he was on top of him. On top of him. Sometimes you ask for the truth, sometimes you insist on the truth. And the truth is the defendant was on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And he had to know. He had to know. The medical examiner would find the cause of George Floyd's death to be cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Well, what you saw the defendant and the other officers doing to George Floyd caused his death. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, death at the hands of another. What the defendant did to George Floyd killed him. It was ruled a homicide. The defendant is charged with murder. He's charged with murder and he's charged with manslaughter. The defendant at the time was a police officer. Okay? It may be hard. It may be hard for any of you to imagine a police officer doing something like this. Remember, in jury selection, and we talked about bias and we talked about setting biases and preconceived notions behind. Well, imagining a police officer committing a crime might be the most difficult thing you have to set aside, because that's just not the way we think of police officers. We trust the police. We trust the police to help us. We believe the police are going to respond to our call for help. We believe they're going to listen to us. And this is strong. This runs deep. I'd say it's difficult to set this aside. I want you to consider that even after, with the bystanders, after they saw what they saw, after they saw this shocking display of abuse of police power and a man murdered in front of them, Genevieve Hansen, she called the police. Donald Williams, he saw this. You heard him. He testified. He called the police. A 9-year-old. Judea. What did she suggest? We need to call the police on the police. That's our expectation. Even after seeing this, even after witnessing this, our expectation is that the police are going to help. And with reason, and with good reason, right? Because policing is a most noble profession. It is. It is. And to be very clear, this case is called the State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. This case is not called the State of Minnesota versus the police. It is not. Policing is a noble profession, and it is a profession. You met several Minneapolis police officers during this trial. You met them. They took the stand. They testified. Make no mistake, this is not a prosecution of the police. It is a prosecution of the defendant. And there's nothing worse for good police than a bad police who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't follow procedure, who doesn't follow training, who ignores the policies of the department, the motto of the department: to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. Chief Arredondo, The chief of police, the Minneapolis Police Department, he took the stand and he testified and he told you what that badge that he wears over his heart means. It's a public service. It's a public trust. They're there to help us. It's a professional organization. There are standards. There are rules. There's a code of conduct. There's a use of force policy. There's extensive training. The police are first responders. They're who we call for help, and they help us. They have CPR training. If there's more training than simply use of force. There's more to policing than putting handcuffs on people and hauling them away, to be true. Right? There's other kinds of training. There's procedural justice. There's crisis intervention training. There's medical training. And there's defensive tactics. And there's de-escalation. All of this training. Hundreds of hours of training. You met the people who staff the training center. And they told you, we don't train this. They told you that.